Well, welcome to this policy exchange event. I'm Rebecca Lowe. I'm State and Society Fellow and convener of the Political Thought Research Group at Policy Exchange. It's great to have you with us. First of all, I have to say, if you're expecting to see some metro mayors, owing to some scheduling changes, it's your lucky day and you're going to see some farmers instead. So welcome. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you very much to our excellent panellists, whom I'll introduce in a moment. But first, let's have a little think about what it is we've tasked them with thinking about today. A few months ago, we started working on an agriculture report. And by we, I mean quite a few of us at Policy Exchange, as you can see from the rather long list at the top of this lovely document. We also have another of the authors, writers with us today, Nicholas Craig-Harvey, too. It quite quickly became obvious to us that this is one of the key issues of the day. Our country's vote to leave the European Union brings big opportunities and challenges. And it is not unfair to claim that the Common Agricultural Policy is indeed the EU's principal policy programme. Therefore, much of the approach to Brexit, in practical terms, can be, in microcosm, seen in an approach to agricultural policy. What do we do about these subsidies? What do we do about these tariffs? About these regulations? About all of this policy which, not for want of trying, has not been open to British influence for 40 years. Since 1973, UK farm and food policies have conformed to the rules and objectives of the CAP. The result of the EU referendum means, therefore, that the British government currently has its first opportunity since the 1970s to shape an agricultural policy that affords proper emphasis to consumers' interests, addresses the sector's inefficiency and poor productivity, and can transform wider economic and environmental outcomes. At the heart of this lie big questions we will address today. Does a modern economy like Britain's still need to aim for self-sufficiency in food, or is food security better achieved through diverse trade links? What impact will Brexit have on food prices and the supply chain? Should subsidies and tariffs be maintained, phased out, or redirected towards environmental goals? How can we ensure high evidence-based standards for food safety and animal welfare while not creating new protectionist barriers? Should Britain let in chlorinated chicken or allow GM crops? How can we ensure agriculture tariffs and regulations don't slow down international trade negotiations? What opportunities are there to help developing countries trade their way to growth? What opportunities are there to improve the rural economy and environmental protection? How can Britain become a leader in agri-tech and ensure we leave the environment better than we found it? These questions and more form the bedrock of Brexit, the backbone of Britain. Today we discuss farming tomorrow, British agriculture after Brexit. So I'm delighted to introduce our excellent panellists to you. We have Anne-Marie Trevelyan, Member of Parliament for Berwick-upon-Tweed, one of the largest rural constituencies in the land. We have Nicholas Craig-Harvey, a farmer and businessman, and as I mentioned, one of our co-authors of Farming Tomorrow. We have Nick von Westenholz, who is Director of EU Exit at the NFU. And we have Louise Davies, Head of Campaigns and Policy at the Vegan Society. Anne-Marie, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here as the MP for Berwick-upon-Tweed, which is deceptive because it's all of Northumberland, really, and everyone else, other than those who live in Berwick, always feel offended. So the 1,000 square miles, most of which is rural agricultural territory, other than the bit of the Cheviots that we keep the Scots out with, no offence to those in the room. It's probably the thing that enters my postbag as often as any other education or DWP issue. But of course, many, many colleagues don't have that. So what has been so extraordinarily interesting, as someone who was always happy to talk about farming, the challenges of subsidies, every autumn, the DEFRA payment system failures end up in our postbag and we hit officials over the head for 3 months before we sort it out. Colleagues have suddenly started to become interested in the whole question of farming, food, environment in a holistic way, which was a conversation that was never had because as part of the EU, we simply weren't a voice, one of 28, not one that was really heard. And so it had sort of lost its voice within the parliamentary conversation, and it was down to a few of us with rural constituencies for whom this was an issue for us. The question always, and came through during the Brexit referendum, well, if we vote leave, no one else but a few of you are bothered about looking after our farming community, and so on and so on. Therefore, we'd better vote to remain, brackets, even though we hate the cap and it doesn't work, and we can see so many better ways to look after our land because politicians don't understand it. It has been an extraordinary revelation to me that that simply wasn't true, and very reassuring, I hope, to all those who farm and who now realise that we are in charge of the destiny of setting how we do this going forward, not just in terms of financial support, but a new, genuinely controllable by us, brackets for better or worse, land use policy. I am married to a farmer and a forester. I live in a world that has a 50-year cycle in its view. He plants trees with the view that his grandson, who doesn't yet exist, will be the one who cuts them down, harvests them, and is able to reinvest in that land. It's an extraordinarily different perspective to the world I live in, which is on a 5-year political cycle. But that is critical. We have the opportunity now, and we must take it to build a framework and to see the strategy we want for our land use, which is holistic and covers all those areas of what land is for, from producing food to growing trees, which holds the water, which produces the wood, which will either keep us warm or hold our houses up, alongside the environmental piece of understanding what Michael Gove talks about so much, which I'm thrilled about, which is understanding that the land and the air, they are our environment, they are our children's future. They are what will produce the food for my grandchildren. That tree will produce an income for my as yet to be invented grandson, and also will be part of so many technological developments that we have even yet thought of. So it's an extraordinary moment, and what I've found really energising as a rural MP is that so many colleagues want to be part of that conversation. Different parts of that conversation, but very much in there. Be it the tech environment that suddenly sees the opportunity for that huge innovation piece, which hasn't really been possible, as Rebecca said, really a kind of a suppression of innovation in so much of the farming space where it needn't have been, because the CAP framework limited so many ways how we might do that. In the forestry piece, how we think about what planting is for and how it affects our environment as humans living within it. An interesting issue raised yesterday with me was the question of where the Highways Agency is sort of effectively deforesting tree lines along roads for safety reasons. The impacts of that environmentally, visually, I hadn't really thought about it as such. In fact, we took down a row of ash trees a few years ago which weren't in very good health. We've never replanted. Why have we not replanted? Because somehow we took them down because there was a safety risk. We haven't thought about that picture in terms of the drainage issues along that road and the other implications. There's such a breadth of areas to look at in terms of how we manage, in terms of economics, how we invest that, as it is now, the sort of $3 billion a year funding pot to drive forwards a holistic, long-term positive land use. And I think Michael Gove puts as well in mind. We want to make sure that we leave our island in a better place than we found it. We have the chance for the first time in 40 years to actually determine how we might do that. And I'm hoping very much that he will lead on something which will be something which I would say, honestly, I'm not sure governments are very good at, which is a strategy which will leap over very many parliamentary terms and set a marker that everyone in Parliament buys into, because it's what the nation needs, wants, and will believe in, which is that our island has so many ecological assets, and we need to make sure that we harness all of them now that we actually can have that control to do so.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Nicholas Craig-Harvey.
Good afternoon. I've been farming on our land for 100 years now, and over the past 2 or 3 years I've really been picking up on the agricultural policies and what should be happening after we've done away with CAP. I think we want to take away the romance and put into place the reality. The British taxpayers put in way over 50 billion into British farming. And what have they got back? They've got a unprofitable, relatively unproductive industry that actually is dominated by old men and takes a view that the consumer should damn well take what we give it. This must change from our point of view, and our concept that we're sort of the God's given men on God's green and pleasant land is something which we must relook at. We mustn't forget that agriculture is the only sector that touches every single person in the United Kingdom every single day. It isn't just actually growing crops. It's whether your trees die in your streets, whether the air is dark and black, as we know too well from burning carcasses from the foot and mouth. It's whether the shelves are empty in the supermarkets, and it's whether the poison chickens are put into the hands of these salesmen who everybody says is trying to poison us. So it isn't just about farming. And as regards to politicians, I think we ought to be aware that the strength of agriculture is also a major weakness. Ruth Davidson's strength in Scotland depends on the rural vote. Northern Ireland's economy depends on their agricultural exports. Your constituents, if they're MPs here, but your fellow members of the party, will not be happy if they can't buy their chickens from the supermarket. They won't be happy if one of them gets poisoned. So if anybody inside the government says the wrong thing at the wrong time or does the wrong thing at the wrong time, they'll be out. Jeremy Corbyn, and this is a surprising factor that I was told this morning, the Labour Party is viewed as the friend of farmers. A surprising fact that someone was pushing to me. So where do you take the reality and take away the romance? I think we have to accept that British food production has to shrink. There is a lot of land which is farmed badly. It's run by farmers who don't understand today, and therefore they shouldn't be what we call creating our green and pleasant land. They are essentially going from farmers to gardeners. So where do we actually take the next stage? I think we should split the subsidies. I think we must take a view that £3 billion is not very much money. And as soon as you start cutting that £3 billion, British agriculture will just get worse. I know it sounds cruel, and I'm sure that some people won't like it, but chemicals run through the veins of the arable farmer in the UK. We use it. We don't particularly benefit the consumer with it. We are paid to do it. We put it on the land and we kill things. Fine. That is the way we produce on bad land. We produce food and we get paid for it. That must change. Secondly, I think we're moving from the producer to the consumer. And my point that it actually affects every person in this country every day of their lives. We have to be aware of what the consumer wants. There is a lot of talk, and I'm a farmer, so I'll talk it too, about the high quality, etc., of British farming. Yes, we're jolly good at it. Yes, we actually produce animals in a way that people like. But the consumer is interested in price. One can't get away from it. There's a lot of polls saying, oh, they'll buy British and they'll only look at top quality. The consumer in days when things are going wrong in the economy will not want to spend excess money on food. How many people will actually know when they go to Safeways where their steak comes from as opposed to how much it costs? But if the British farmer gets his marketing right, if the British farmer sells the product the consumer wants, we'll be in with the best. So what I think that the government should be looking at is looking at us investors. We're not looking at it as a contract. We're not looking at quickly see if we can find the small print and get out of it. You are investors alongside us. And so what we want is to get the biggest bang for our bucks, we as taxpayers. Farming, go for the good producers. Help us with the marketing. Help us to get the retailers, get the supermarkets moving. They're not doing a great job. In exchange, get rid of the tariffs. We do believe that reduces prices. We do believe that it is a block on trade. But let's get some money out of farming as much as we get in. Mr. Gove is concentrating on the environment, as Rebecca was saying. How can we get money from the environment? Well, there's a man called Dieter Helm who's produced something called the Natural Capital Valuation Fund. We can make money out of the environment by helping farmers, yes, farmers, because they own the land, helping farmers use that land for environmental purposes. I've taken out the land that is infarmable, put into it trees, put into it animals that you want to. Get the people working with the farmers to do some good for the environment, and at the end of the day, there'll be benefits for all parties. Now, I'm going to say something which a lot of the Conservative Party may not like, which is build on British land. What is wrong if you're short of affordable houses, if you're short of space in cities, if you're short of making rural communities go, why not build on British land? Use the money that people, developers and farmers make to go into the environmental schemes we're talking about. If a man is making £1 million an acre, take a share of it, put it into something that the local community want. And that I think I will underline is you get the local communities involved in agriculture. I think it's wonderful that Mr. Gove could talk nationally, but I don't know where people live here, if you live in Suffolk, Cornwall, Cumberland or Shropshire, you've got a local feeling. Get involved. That is what I think we're going to get, is if you want to get benefit, if you want to make money out of the agricultural economy, let everybody concentrate on what they want out of it. Local beef, good environmental aspects, and a rural economy where they want to live. I'm just going to end on 2 bugbears, and please, I'll answer any questions later. I've got 2 or 3 bugbears. My first one is, we're too old. You're looking at an old fart. We are too old. Get the young into farming. 3% of British farmers are under 30. Now, that is pathetic. Young people should be able to get into it, and I can talk you through later ways you can do it, but get the young into it. And my second bugbear, which I'm afraid it doesn't always get remembered, get women into farming. It is at 73% of British farmers are men. Women are good farmers. There's none of this nonsense about they can't do the heavy stuff. We have machines for it. Women know how to look after animals. Women know how to organise computers and everything. They are as well educated. Get women in, get young people in, and you'll get the future of British farming profitable for everybody. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thanks. Let's turn to Nick.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here today. It's actually it's really pleasing to be involved in an event at party conferences organised by sort of one of the mainstream think tanks focusing on farming. It very rarely happens. The NFU always organises events throughout the party conference season, and obviously we focus on farming, but very few others do. And I think it's as you touched on, Rebecca, it's a demonstration of the fact that Brexit probably impacts farming more than any other sector. It really, our membership of the EU really has, for better or for worse, defined farming in the UK over the last 40 plus years. And so our departure from the EU will equally have an enormous impact, again, for better or for worse. Our job is obviously to try and make it for better. But, you know, if you look at that impact, it really is across the board. Trade, at the moment, 70% of the produce that British farmers grow and produce is exported to the EU. And of course, it's exported to the EU within the single market, so no tariffs, etc. So any change in that relationship will de facto have an enormous impact on UK farming. Labour and the ending of free movement. Farming relies very heavily, certainly some sectors, on non-UK workers. If you look at some of the seasonal workforce requirements in, for example, fruit and veg, up to about 80,000 non-UK workers are needed in that sector on a seasonal basis. So again, a restriction in the ability of farming to access the labour that it needs, which it currently gets largely from the EU, is going to have a big impact on farming. Regulation, you know, we have been members of the Common Agricultural Policy, as mentioned, for over 40 years, and most of the regulations and the rules that farmers currently operate under are therefore derived from the EU, even if many of them have been adapted and implemented by UK governments. So the future for the UK outside the EU and the laws and regulations that govern farming will have a big impact, and it'll be interesting to see the extent to which those start diverging from the current EU rules once we leave. And of course, very closely related to that is what has already been discussed at some depth, the support system. the way in which farmers under the Common Agricultural Policy are paid farm support and what they're required to do. And that will clearly, even though we have had a commitment for some short extension of payments to farmers once we leave the EU, there is clearly a very lively and I'd say healthy debate about the nature of future farm support, something that the Policy Exchange Report has fed into. And I just wanted to quickly say a few things on that future agricultural policy. I think it's quite right that a lot of the debate has been around the environment, about the impact farmers have on the environment, and about how a future agricultural policy might incentivise and reward farmers to protect and enhance the environment on which they operate. But often what gets missed is a really crucial aspect of farm support, which is if you want farmers to do well for the environment, if you want them to look after the environment, you need to have healthy, viable farms operating in our country. Farms cover something like 75% of the landmass in the UK. There's basically a ready-made force sitting there, able to deliver the environmental goods people want. So having those farms operative, efficient, productive is important. And so a future agricultural policy needs to be about more than just devising ways of rewarding and incentivizing strict environmental measures. That's an important part, but it also needs to be about increasing and improving productivity on farm. And by that, I don't mean increasing production, just yields going up and producing more. I mean more efficient production, so producing more from less, a more efficient turnover of inputs into outputs. And also, it's a fact of life that farming will be impacted by wider volatility in the markets, whether that's through inefficient markets not rewarding farmers properly or climate weather events, etc. Farming does have to weather some significant volatility. That's why nearly every country in the world has some sort of farm support system that helps to manage the volatility and the risk that farmers have to try and navigate. So those three measures are going to be crucial in a future agricultural policy: environmental measures, volatility measures, and productivity measures. Now, to finish off, you might ask, well, why? Why should the taxpayer, the public, be asked to support farming in that way? And I think that's some of the questions that have been flushed out a little bit through the Policy Exchange Report. Well, I'd say there are three very, very good reasons. Firstly, I come back to the environment. I said it already. We're on the land. We're covering about 75% of it. Having a vibrant, viable farming sector means you can actually have farmers out there able to deliver some of those environmental goals. So that's really crucial. Secondly, the economy more broadly. The wider food and drink industry is our largest manufacturing sector here in the UK. They are very supportive of ongoing support for farming because they rely, and of course they import goods as well, but they rely very heavily on domestically produced food and the sort of food, British food, that British consumers say that they want. And of course, not just the wider economy, but local rural economies as well, and rural communities. Farmers are very, very important to that. And then finally, I think it comes around to what I describe as well-being. The fact that you as consumers, you enjoy British food, but you also, I hope, trust British food. If you've got British producers producing British food through British supply chains, you understand, I think, fairly well how those work and the credibility and trust that is attached to those, to the extent you do not have if we're exporting greater and greater amounts of food from overseas. So British producers doing that really is important, touches on food security as well. And what I would say just quickly, Nick touched on consumers and talked about the fact that we can't sort of just tell them that they've got to take what they're given. Well, I don't think that's the case at all. I mean, UK consumers now spend about 10% of their income on food. That's the lowest ever. It's a very small amount, and they have choice greater than ever. If we reduce the capacity of British farmers to produce food, then you will lose that choice, that variability, which consumers at the moment here in the UK really value. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick. And Louise?
Thanks. So you might be wondering what the Vegan Society can contribute to this debate. We have a vision of a world with no animal exploitation, so ultimately we'd like to see a move away from livestock farming. But we do care about farmers, and the food on a vegan plate can be grown in Britain, and there are much more wider benefits of vegan-friendly agriculture, which would link up our environmental policies with our health policies and our agricultural policy. There are 500,000 vegans in the UK at the moment, and we're on the rise. No doubt you'll have seen more vegan restaurants, products, and friends and family interested in veganism. This morning we launched a report written by the New Economics Foundation about the solutions for sustainable farming, which focused on the opportunities that plant protein crops can offer, so peas, beans, and lentils. So yeah, the Vegan Society person is going to be talking to you about lentils for a while, I'm afraid, stereotypically. But yeah, it is important, and I'll explain why. So as we've heard, we have a broken food system at the moment, and if we take the environmental angle in particular, there are huge problems due to animal agriculture. Biodiversity is increasing most rapidly on our farmlands, and we can see that by the declining farmland birds due to use of pesticides. Animal agriculture is hugely water intensive, and in addition, the farming sector is the #1 culprit of water pollution incidents, and that's above water companies and bio-waste and landfill. And thirdly, climate change. Globally, animal agriculture is responsible for as much greenhouse gases as all transport combined. And the agriculture sector is not stepping up to meet targets. So in the last 2 years, the UK power sector has already made the reductions that the agriculture sector is projected to make in the next 35 years. So put simply, we need to reduce the number of animals we farm in order to meet our climate change targets. Plant proteins can provide an alternative. There are 4 reasons why. They're sustainable, they have low environmental impact, they're nitrogen fixing, so there's no nitrogen fertilizer needed, and they have a positive impact on the soil and lower emissions. Secondly, they're nutritious, they're high in protein, iron and fibre, a great alternative to animal protein. Thirdly, they're affordable. In order to meet the changes recommended in the government's Eat Well guide, if you look at a meal on the same budget, we need to increase bean and pulse consumption by 90% and reduce red meat by 78%. And that's another example where our health policy and our agricultural policy don't match. So our public health messages are telling us to eat more beans and pulses and eat less red meat, but we're farming red meat and we're not growing beans and pulses in the UK. And fourthly, plant proteins are ethical in that there are no animal lives are lost. So if UK diets are to be sustainable, healthy, affordable and ethical, protein crops present a win-win-win-win. Obviously, there are barriers to this, and they're outlined in our report, from lower yields, cost of production, risk factors, consumer demand, lack of knowledge and tradition, amongst other reasons. But we have got a set of recommendations that we'd like politicians to consider, particularly in the context of post-Brexit agricultural policy. Firstly, looking at public procurement, so serving UK-grown plant protein in public sector canteens. Looking at how we can support plant protein growers with an aid scheme, so getting new plant protein entrepreneurs to start farming, giving them direct payments which would be guaranteed for at least 10 years, and then also looking at an entry scheme which would give access to land, provide startup costs and training. These recommendations tie in with what the Land Workers Alliance have said as well. We also really need to do research and development in this area. In the 70s, Canada and the UK were producing the same amount of plant protein crops. Now Canada produces 20 times more than the UK and is the world's biggest exporter, and that's due to research and development. So we are recommending 10 years of funding support to be replaced by an industry levy. We need to consult with a wider range of stakeholders when looking at agricultural policy. So it's fantastic to be on this debate and be part of these sorts of discussions, because this, plant protein isn't part of the conversation at the moment. So where is the voice for future protein crop growers in policy discussions? We need to make sure they're represented. And then lastly, looking at farm subsidies. So we recommend that farm subsidies are deducted for the environmental and health losses in animal farming. We could look at a meat tax or a VAT on meat products, but the recommendation is that they're deducted from the subsidies. So there are many uncertainties of the Brexit process, but it's clear that agricultural policy is going to change. Plant proteins have potential to be transformative in the UK agriculture and allow us to lead the way in a genuinely sustainable food system.
That's wonderful, thanks so much. Various of our panellists touched on the changing role we might see farmers taking on, or indeed a better recognition of the current or potential roles that they already play, whether that's through cutting direct subsidies and focusing the remaining subsidies on environmental externalities, or whether it's in producing more of our food. I wonder, just to kick off the questions, if they might each briefly let us know what their utopian vision for the agricultural sector of the coming decades might be. Nicholas?
Yes, I think it'll be smaller in food production. I think it'll be bigger in the environmental aspects. I think you will turn a lot of farmers into gardeners, in the sense of having to look after the countryside as opposed to maximising the production out of it. There has to be diversification. Tourism is there. And as I say, I think that if money comes into it through other things, and I went into property development, but there are others, I think you will find there'll be money for farmers to invest for the rural communities and for the rest of the community.
Wonderful. Anne-Marie?
I come back to the word holistic. That's how I view our land. The fact that we're an island, I think, it is really important to me, and I think it needs to be in terms of how we manage that land asset. And interestingly, Louise, is that our water management, I think, is critical. We need something that we need to be acutely aware of. I think the utopian view is that I hate the word subsidy, and what it has driven is a cultural behaviour which has reduced productivity and innovation. I want to call it investment. I want to invest in our land production, land use in a number of ways. So to have a framework which will be all about investing, we invest in R&D, new innovation, we invest in it. We don't give them a subsidy, we invest in it because we see its future potential. So I want the framework to be one where our land management programme, which is a key part of everything government thinks about, is invested in a number of ways, both to ensure we have a food security framework that is real, that we have an environmental management programme which has that long-term management and going, as Michael always says, better than we found it.
Fantastic. Nick?
Well, I hope farmers won't be gardeners. I hope they'll still be farmers producing food. I think that's important. And I agree as well. I think I would like to see in 10 years' time a scenario where government funding into farming wasn't considered subsidy, but was absolutely considered investment, and that the majority of that investment went into, or ought to go into, improving productivity in the industry on the one hand, and where applicable, rewarding and incentivising farmers for environmental goods on the others, and farmers having the ability to tap into those as suits them, so that they can continue to do what they do well in looking after the environment, but also in producing food. As I mentioned earlier, there'll always be some requirement, I think, for at least a baseline investment or payment for managing volatility in the sector. But hopefully that can get smaller and smaller as farms get more resilient, more efficient, more productive, and do so in a sustainable way. Then you reduce the reliance on that, and it really does start looking like investment in farming.
Fantastic. And Louise?
We spent a lot of time thinking about the utopian vegan future. So yeah, as I said, our vision would be no animal farming. So we'd like to see a thriving legumes, vegetable, plant protein sector with new entrants to the market, supported through government policies who are providing food for a vegan diet.
Fantastic. Well, it's lovely to see such a fine audience here today. So why don't we turn it over to some questions? A few quick house rules. Ideally, questions will be questions, so about a sentence long with a question mark at the end would be great. And also, if you give your name and organisation or who you're representing, or if you're representing yourself, then that would be great too. Thanks so much. Why don't we have the man at the end of the row over there? I think a microphone is heading towards you.
My name's John McMahon from Chester. I've just got a question for Nicholas. I'm not in the farming sector, but I have a friend who's a dairy farmer. What he tells me, he's an old man like me.
Like me, yeah.
But what he tells me is he's been putting more and more cows by buying up land. So in some respects, I'm sure his productivity, because he's not taking on more labour, must be have increased. But in your utopian vision, you saw some less farming going on. So one assumes that post-Brexit, the price of land will drop because he's seen exactly the opposite. I'm speaking from somebody not connected with your sector.
Great, let's just take a couple more questions, shall we? We'll do them in threes, maybe. Why don't we have the man in the blue jacket at the back? Sorry, quite a few blue jackets. So I say the one in the lanyards. That's my personal favourite. Yeah.
David Bowles, RSPCA. For those of you that don't know, RSPCA sure produces around half the eggs we eat in this country and around about a third of the pork meat that we eat in this country. So my question to Nick is very clear. The UK has some of the highest animal welfare standards in the world. Not the highest, but some of the highest. And at the moment they are protected undoubtedly by tariffs from cheaper imports coming in. If we're going to do trade deals with the USA, with Canada, which do not have federal animal welfare standards and have still the traditional battery cage and the pig sow stall systems, how are we going to protect our farmers? And I'm using the word protect, not in a protectionist way, but in a realistic way. How are we going to ensure that we're going to have a vibrant laying hen and pig farming sector going forward unless we stop imports coming in which are not produced to our standards?
Correct, and we've got one at the front here as well. If that's all right.
So, just speaking from a very urban background, I'll put the cat among the pigeons. Sorry. Speaking from an urban background, I'm just staggered at what I sense the sense of entitlement in the farming industry. It's an industry that has subsidies. It wants volatility payments that pay out when things are bad, but never seem to tax back when things are good. It wants to bring in low-wage immigrants because it won't pay domestic staff enough to attract them. It wants tariff walls. So, on the environmental front, why don't we just treat it the same way as we treat industry? If it's bad, we ban it and we fine you, and if it's really bad, we send you to jail, and just scrap the assumption that we have to pay you not to poison the country.
Okay, so we've got land pricing, animal welfare, and banning bad stuff. Nicholas, you seem to have some fans. I think we'll start with you first.
Can I just say that the urban gentleman, I think is, I'm sorry I didn't bring it up, is a very important question for British farming. We should aim to be the highest common factor, and if you're good at farming, you should be able to expand. I'm not in favour of saying there is a limit to where you go to. Okay, people who own land don't farm it and shouldn't be getting millions of pounds just for sitting on it. But put money into farming. Let farming succeed. And your dairy farming friend is patently good. And we should go for the higher and better qualified farmers. I couldn't agree more. Support them. I think the animal welfare point is a very fair one, but you can have contracts regarding controls. You can actually have we're a border, we're an island, so you can actually have an agreement which says you're not allowed to have ABC. What I think is an interesting point about this, which is we have in pharmaceutical medicine world something called NICE, which is really to do with chemical, isn't it, excellence. Why don't we have a knife? Why don't we have something for farming excellence? NICE is made up of laymen, pharmacists, doctors, scientists. It's not just made up of pharmaceutical companies. Why don't we work together in order to create the sort of qualities that you're asking about? Why don't we get a consumer-farmer agreement, people, consumer, farmer, producer, RSPCA, people together? What is excellence? Why don't we judge it on an objective fashion? We have, for the people here who are not farmers, we're having a debate at the moment about chemicals called neonicotinoids, which the question is, do they kill bees? Well, personally, I'm not a chemist. Personally, there should be objective judgment. Personally, yes, they might kill bees. Don't have them. If it's bees versus black grass, the public want bees. So that is something that NIFE could do. But I do underline your point, I think, which is we should work together. It shouldn't be that's why I don't think it's a contract. I think it's a mutual investment agreement. Who can get the most out of farming and go to the highest common factor to get the most out of it? Yeah. Yeah.
He buys the land, 10 years later, the price of the land has gone up. He's, millionaire.
Should I answer that, Rebecca?
So if you're saying that post-Brexit you need less farmers, surely we should be already seeing the price of land,
Yes.
agricultural land, dropping.
Yeah, it has
in
run down.
anticipation.
It's gone from about 15,000 to about 11,000 in the past 2 years. It is dropping, mainly because of the failing of subsidies. But you're right, if farmland comes down, you'll get my young people in, you'll get the young people in, and you'll get the good farmers in. So you're right, I think farmland will fall.
Anne-Marie, is that right?
Well, I think there are two in terms of land value, changing land usage, and we have still a huge housing shortage which is not yet balanced out. Whilst population growth is slowing, globally and is pretty much at a grinding halt across the Western world, the reality is that we haven't got our housing mix right. So land has that particularly skewed control over values. But I think, again, I love the knife idea. I love it. It's a funny word too. There's a whole amusement factor to a politician in that one.
That's why I thought you'd ask, probably.
But actually, it's a really interesting point. We do have, lots of organisations speaking, but there has been for many years a separation of those voices. I come back to it. I'll bore you all, bring the face, the holistic view. The forestry voice speaks. The local councils, in terms of making their housing plans, speak. And the farming voice, the NFU, who do such a great job for their members, speak. But in terms of how are we looking at it overall, is it just the central government that says, well, we've decided this, that's the policy, or are we actually going to draw together in a really constructive way for that long-term view, as NICE does with, determining not only how much the government should be investing in terms of medical interventions for each of us on an annualised basis. That next question, which is, if it's something new, it's a new medical intervention, we're saying we all need to think about this together. And as technology moves forwards, to have that cohesive voice that's bringing everyone together and makes a, maybe sometimes a compromise decision, but actually a genuinely a cohesive decision which everyone can buy into, we're more likely to make the best use of our land, both for food and all those other things that we want to do, and we won't be stuck in any particular rut because those voices will work together to move it forward.
Louise?
Well, regarding the question on land, depending on what happens with the new subsidy system, if we do see that there's new cheaper land available, then that's an opportunity for potential plant protein growers to go and try new things, and we might see big landowners like National Trust offering some of that land up for research and development, which would be great. The point on RSPCA, I completely agree. We really do need to be careful that we keep the highest levels of protections that we have, and don't have the race to the bottom in terms of standards. And then the third question about penalties for environmental misbehaviour, absolutely, wholeheartedly with you there. But we need to look at what that definition is. If we're genuine about damage to the environment, then what's the penalty for farming animals which are hugely problematic in terms of their emissions?
Yeah, carbon tax on them.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Some agreement. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, on the standards issue, absolutely, we've said clearly that any trade negotiations and future trade deals that the government looks at should not in any way undermine the very high standards of UK producers, and I think that's absolutely key. And actually, for us, as I said at the very beginning, the EU is a really important market, and I think it will remain so. You've got 450 million relatively affluent customers on our doorstep. British producers will still need to export to the EU, whatever happens after Brexit. So that has got to be the priority. What happens with other trade deals with countries who have different regulatory standards and different standards of production needs to be dealt with very, very carefully. And I would say that the government needs to be incredibly careful not to rush into a future trade deal just to try and demonstrate that it has the ability to do so. We would absolutely say that impact assessments and the like on what future trade deals will mean for British farming is a key element of those future negotiations. Coming to the point of sort of sense of entitlement amongst farmers, I'm obviously doing a bad job, so I tried to cover that off in my introductory remarks. But I think, firstly, farming is, apart from a couple of exceptions, subsidised to a higher level than the EU across the world. So there is just the plain economics of a level playing field where we compete with producers elsewhere who are supported by their governments. The reason generally governments do that is because A, food production is seen as strategically important. I think that is true. You all need to eat food, and you will be eating food today. Secondly, the governments see... I've lost my train of thought, sorry. Coming back to the original points I made in my introduction, the fact that if you flip it round and try and ask yourself, what would it look like were we not to have a viable, productive farming sector? You would have that 75% of the land no longer occupied. I mean, obviously, that's a Armageddon-type scenario, but there are farmers on that land delivering the sort of environmental goods that people would like to be delivered. You would be relying entirely on imports from overseas, produced to different standards you have no control over. And we've talked about the importance of, we've talked about bees, we've talked about biodiversity. Do we really expect if we're exporting production overseas that we can guarantee that those standards of animal welfare or biodiversity protection are going to be observed? No. And then finally, that point about food security and about trust and reliance in our food system. If we don't support our farmers, then we're going to be buying food from overseas. We've seen the problems recently with Brazilian abattoirs and the meat industry. That's where our food will be coming from. So if we want to have some sort of control and reliance on our food system, then we need to support our farmers here in the UK to produce that food.
Fantastic. I think we've got time for another couple of questions, so we can keep them brief. Yes, lady on the side over here. Should be, there it is, to your left, to your right. Thanks.
Hiya, Kira Box from Friends of the Earth. I just wanted to say, firstly, actually, how positive I think this discussion is, and I was prepared not to agree with many people in the room about many things, and it's great that we're all pulling in the same direction, and there is so much focus on ensuring that farming in the future does offer really tangible environmental benefits. And I do think we need to be clear that farmers do offer environmental benefits. They shouldn't just be fined for doing bad things. They should be rewarded for stewarding the countryside, for planting nitrogen-fixing crops, for providing us with plant-based protein, and for a whole range of other activities that support our water and our air quality. But I suppose my question is, in Farming Tomorrow, I felt a real sense of concern about maintaining the precautionary principle. But actually, in the conversation today, it feels like we're all in agreement that it's not in farmers' interests for our bee populations, for our pollinators to decline. And it feels also like we're all in agreement that NIFE would be a great organisation to ensure that we are reviewing all of the scientific evidence and ensuring that we're not bringing in chemicals that might have unintended consequences. So my question is, at the moment, the withdrawal bill doesn't protect those principles. And can I see some support from the panel to lobby for that bill to change so that those principles are enshrined? And it's for us to have a decision after we've left Europe as to how we implement precaution in this country. But the principle itself, I'd like to see if there's some agreement on the panel that we should maintain that.
Okay, we've got time for one more quick question. Hand shot up over there in the blue tie.
Going back to the point about the price of land, how does the panel think about the effect of inheritance tax the effect of inheritance tax on land? And is that not the main reason for land prices going up from an investor's point of view?
Okay,
it's highly tax efficient to invest in land, which will keep. There's a limited supply. If you take away the inheritance tax benefits, would that not automatically bring the price down, and maybe new younger entrants will be able to afford to buy the land?
Okay, so we've got protecting the precautionary principle, and we've also got inheritance tax. Louise.
Well, I agree with Kira on protecting the precautionary principle in the withdrawal bill. The other thing I just want to mention on that is at the moment it doesn't include Article 13, which declares that animals are sentient. This is something that Compassion in World Farming are campaigning on at the moment, and that surely has to be the bedrock of our relationships with animals, is to recognise that they're sentient beings. And The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness has declared that. A bunch of scientists. There should really be no question in that. So we absolutely have to get that back included in the repeal bill. I'm not really sure about the inheritance tax question, I'm afraid. Potentially a bit too political for me.
Okay, sure. Good answer. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, we agree that the precautionary principle should be retained. I think in its there is a value to the precautionary principle. Clearly, taking a precautionary approach to things that might cause harm is sensible. However, we would, I think, take issue with the way that the precautionary principle is sometimes deployed and implemented, and sometimes the way it's used to argue particular cases. So I think actually there's an opportunity here with Brexit as we devise our sort of own UK-based regulatory system to have a much more clearer exposition of the precautionary principle and clearer guidance of how and when it's used, and to try and get as much buy-in across industry, voluntary sector, etc., as possible, because there is clearly value in the precautionary principle if it's deployed correctly. I mean, in terms of land prices and IHT, I mean, there is, I think, conflicting views on the extent to which IHT drives land purchases, and actually sometimes if you look at the land markets, it goes through peaks and troughs of farmers, productive farmers buying land, and most of the time they're doing it because they're using it for its productive value. But you do raise a good question in terms of how you get younger entrants into it, how you try and increase access into farming, which I think is an important element of actually a future agricultural policy. And there are aspects of that other than land prices, although that is one. And a lot of farmers are tenants; they're not owners. So how tenancies are structured is another important element as well.
Lovely. Anne-Marie?
I think you're right in terms of the precautionary principle. It's vital, and going forwards, whilst the withdrawal bill is, if you like, the first part of the whole Brexit move forwards process, the agricultural bill, which will come in, if you like, to sit on top of it, because obviously we're stepping out of the existing framework, will also be an area where we need to be very alive to the fact that is where we can really push that message through. And I think, there's, again, and as I said in my opening remarks, the reality of how alive all of your MPs now are to this whole area of policy debate has genuinely surprised me, and I think you will have an opportunity to really feed that in now as we head into this autumn session, which will no doubt be, lively. I'll use that word advisedly. That actually those are the sort of issues that need to be talked about, because you think about it a great deal. Friends of the Earth are, an organisation who are absolutely focused on these really important matters, but very, very many colleagues haven't sat and thought through the complexities of it, because these whole areas have not been discussed in any great detail, other in certain more kind of focus courses. So do use the opportunity to really educate colleagues, and so that becomes part of that conversation as we're bringing in that agricultural bill. And I think Michael Gove is very alive to that broader principle. But I think use the cohort of MPs across all parties to really to educate. I think honestly, I think there's an education piece to do there, and now is the time to be doing it.
We're very happy to brief anyone and everyone.
You know where we live.
There's a kind offer. And to Nicholas.
I'll be quick. Promote knife as an idea, and we could get somewhere. Yes, inheritance tax will reduce the price, but the people who buy, in my experience, who buy for inheritance tax planning are the people who actually bring in farmers through the tenancies, and they put money into the environment. So they bring young farmers in as much as they put the price up, so that it makes more adaptable.
Wonderful. I'd love to take some more questions, but I think I'm afraid we're out of time. Not least because I'm being told that there is a queue outside the door already for our next event. So if you'd like to stay for that, do. But otherwise, if you could, but I'd just like to thank our panelists. I think you agree that they have dealt with this topic very comprehensively.